We would support a former Liberal like Mr. Chrétien. We've said it for several months. I was glad to see former Prime Minister Mulroney mention that as well. The minister admits she can't get a call returned. Sending a prominent former Prime Minister, I think, would be a way to show we value the relationship and it needs a reset.
Welcome back. It's been 6 months since the arrest of a Huawei executive in Vancouver and the detention of two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, in China. Yesterday, the Canadian press reported that former Progressive Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney suggested a high-level delegation should be sent to plead Canada's case to China, and it should be led by former Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Up until about 5 seconds ago, Mr. Chrétien hadn't commented on the idea, but his spokesperson just sent out a statement saying, if the Prime Minister asks Mr. Chrétien, he would be prepared to go to China to serve Canada at this difficult time to help our farmers and bring our two Canadians home. So, should the government do so and change its approach to China? Send in the man who made Team Canada a thing in Beijing? The Power Panel is here to weigh in. In Calgary, journalist Jen Gerson. Marty Patriquin of iPolitics is with us from Montreal. And here with me, Maclean's Paul Wells and the CBC's John Paul Tasker. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Ben.
Nice to see you. Happy Friday. Paul, I'm going to start with you. So, Mr. Chrétien has effectively put the ball in the Prime Minister's court.
Where it may stay for a while, because it's a hard call. The idea that Prime Minister Mulroney floated was that they would send Jean Chrétien and Andy Desmarais. I liked that.
The use of Andy.
Yeah, exactly.
Good old Andy.
Which would essentially be a top-level message to the Chinese that Canada's policy towards China, Canada's obsequious policy of letting the Chinese do whatever they want in hopes of getting some market share, has not changed, or that we've returned to that illustrious policy of governments past. The alternative is for the government to say, look, it's a terrible thing that canola exports are throttled and that these two former diplomats are essentially being held hostage. But we're not going to overlook the fact that a Huawei executive is facing trial. We're incidentally not going to overlook the fact that 1 million Uyghur Muslims are being held in the largest detention camps since the Holocaust in the western part of China, stuff like that. And that we actually think that matters. There is substantial pressure on the government to send Mr. Chrétien and Andy Desmarais to essentially make it clear to the Chinese that we are no longer going to make a fuss over stuff like that. There are many people in Canada who would prefer that the government continue to make a fuss over stuff like that.
Jen, what do you think? What's the calculation now for the government?
Well, okay, on one hand, I actually don't think it can hurt to try to send a delegation over there to try and rebuild some bridges and reestablish some diplomatic contacts in the hopes of bringing some of our Canadians home and resolving some of the what appear to be escalating trade retaliations that China is taking against us as a result of the detention of Meng Wanzhou. That said, I have three elements of skepticism behind all of this. I happened to be talking to a China expert today, and she said, first thing, will the Chinese actually take a delegation? If they're not answering phones from ministers right now, who's to say they would even allow anybody in? If they're trying to make a point about how little they need Canada, how much do they need Jean Chrétien? Secondly, how many contacts? We know that there's a long history of good relations between Jean Chrétien and China generally, but how good are the relations between Mr. Chrétien and the current Chinese regime? Part of what's fundamentally shifted between Canada and China in the last few years, and China and the West in the last few years, is the rise of current President Xi Jinping, who appears to be increasingly empowering hardliners within China. What are Mr. Chrétien's relationships like with the current president? That, I think, is a sort of an unknown. And thirdly, sending a delegation and reestablishing contacts are all fine and good, but what actual concessions can Canada make here, realistically? We can't just overturn the rule of law on Ms. Wanzhou just because it's inconvenient for our foreign affairs situation in China. That's not how things work here. I think there are a lot of people who try to treat the current spat between Canada and China as like, oh, both sides are just making a fuss. well, no, both sides aren't just making a fuss. We can't actually compromise on the situation with Ms. Meng, so there's nothing to offer the Chinese that could potentially break the ice in this impasse. So those would be sort of my points of skepticism and caution on this. But that said, I don't think I can reasonably object to sending a delegation over there in the first place.
Marty, I want to get your thoughts. I just want to recap for our viewers that Brian Mulroney had spoken to the Canadian press yesterday and floated this idea of sending Jean Chrétien along with his son-in-law, right, to China to sort of plead the Canadian case. And Mr. Chrétien just moments ago responded through his spokesperson saying, if the Prime Minister asks Mr. Chrétien, he would be prepared to go to China to serve Canada at this difficult time to help our farmers and bring our 2 Canadians home. So, Marty, talk a little bit about the point that Jen and Paul both referenced, I think, is that, there are obviously a lot of considerations here. What we do know for sure is that nobody in the Canadian government can get a call back at this point.
Well, that's exactly it. And I'm with Jen in the sense that, the politics of personality are great when it comes to Mr. Chrétien stateside. Everybody knows him as the sort of pro-Chinese former PM who opened up a corridor there and, is probably the most pro-Chinese PM since the first since Pierre Trudeau. But again, I think this goes beyond personality. This is way bigger. This is way bigger than any one person in any one trade delegation possibly could be. The problem and the beginning and the end of the problem is the fact that we did what we did with Meng Wanzhou, and you can't really get around that. China has been hurt economically. China has been slighted diplomatically. China and Huawei, I would point out. On the world stage, and they are trying to save face. We'd have to literally put the toothpaste back in the bottle with Meng Wanzhou in order to do anything about that. I mean, again, it's all well and good, and it sort of speaks to the desperation that Canadian politicians and Canadian political class are in right now, that we would go and say, throw out everything and say that let's do this. That we're at this point right now.
I mean, nobody is, to be fair, saying Jean Chrétien go negotiate away, concede away anything Canada has to concede. Although Jen raises a good point, not sure what concessions there would be, but there is just no dialogue happening at this point.
So you know who they're actually talking to? Nova Scotia Premier Stephen McNeil.
That's true.
He just got back last month. He's been there 7 or 8 times.
Wouldn't raise the issue.
He wouldn't raise the issue, but why don't we send him along as part of that delegation? I mean, Ambassador Liu, before he got on a jet and jetted off to Paris and left here in a hurry, he was in Halifax 2 weeks ago meeting with McNeil.
Yeah, but Mr. McNeil didn't raise the plight of the 2 Canadians. They talked in general terms apparently, but he didn't.
But he can maybe massage the relationship, get things going again. He could be part of. Part of the team that just tries to break down the door. I mean, if they're not even returning Chrystia Freeland's calls, we're at an impasse, and that's probably a polite way of describing it. Maybe we can have some of these people that are actually doing business with China. I mean, they're sending 12 million kilograms of lobster to China every year. They're doing well. They're not in the canola situation right now. So he's got the ticket. He's got the secret sauce.
The latest Angus Reid poll suggests Premier McNeil is so unpopular at home, he might as well go to China.
It's true.
Well, the other thing you got to realize too is that this is a government, again, and I've said it before on the show, is that this is a government that is willing, because it has been slighted on the world stage, that it is willing to not only essentially hold 2 Canadian diplomats hostage, but let's not forget they converted the sentences of prisoners to death sentences because of what we did to a woman who runs a phone company. A delegation is not going to be able to do much about that.
I think, relations will be frosty until, they're not going to take their foot off our throats until we deal with the Meng Wanzhou situation. But I would say it's probably not going to be better under any other Canadian political leader in this country. Let's not forget, Andrew Scheer just gave a foreign affairs speech, and he called China the worst perpetrators of authoritarian values in the world, worse than Russia. So if we elect Andy Scheer in the fall, it's not going to be any better. We don't really have the relation.
Well, I mean, there's a whole debate that can be had over what kind of policy do you pursue. I mean, there have been changes in this government's policy from going from wanting free trade to now difference in the last government's policy, which prioritized human rights at the beginning and then ended up visiting there twice and making a lot of economic agreements. It's difficult to, every government seems to find this a hard one.
Even the fiercest China hawks aren't proposing that Canadian businesses now doing business in China pack their bags and come home. And so the question is always going to be, what's the balance between engagement and essentially surrender? But I wish we had more frequent acknowledgement from this government that the Chinese regime that they're dealing with is different in kind, different in ferocity, different in the ambition of their plans from its predecessors.
To Jen's point, what do you think then about Mr. Chrétien and his ability to interact with this regime versus the ones he's used to?
Jean Chrétien is good at getting deals. His public statements on China have suggested that he doesn't acknowledge that the current Chinese administration is different from the one he used to deal with, and that's unsettling.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.